At 6 a.m. sharp, I opened my door to a winter sky the color of steel, and the HOA president standing on my porch with 2 sheriff's deputies waving what she called an emergency demolition order. She told me my handmade snow cabin would be coming down by sundown. What Trish Kincaid didn't know was the one detail that would turn her world inside out. My entire parcel sits inside federal forest land, and by nightfall, the only thing collapsing wasn't my cabin. My name is Mason Hale, and I didn't move up here to fight with anyone. I came to breathe again, to hear the wind in the pines, and let the quiet do the kind of work that counselors try to put into words. 2 years back, I lost my wife, Claire, and that grief had a way of making every room in our old house feel too small. So I built a cabin on the ridge at Silver Birch Summit. Not fancy, just 80 square feet that I framed with my own hands. Metal roof that sheds snow like a champ solar array that hums when the sun finally pulls itself over the ridgeline composting system that would make an engineer smile. Everything permitted. Stamped inspected. Because I'm ex-Air Force logistics and paperwork is my native language. The association down the hill is supposed to plow the entry road and keep the signs from turning into yard art. You know what I mean? But it also elected a president who treats bylaws like scripture. Trish shows up in a white SUV that somehow stays clean on mud realtor plates clipboard, like a badge heels clicking on rock, like she's walking into a closing. First time she came up my drive, it was October, or aspen leaves, crisp underfoot, my breath rising like smoke, while I split logs. And she didn't say good morning, just raised her phone and started snapping my solar panels and rain barrels, like she'd discovered contraband. Then she gave me the speech. Architectural review. $500 to start fines of $50 a day until compliance. And I told her calm that I never signed any HOA documents. My family's held this ridge since the 80s. The county approved the plans and signed the inspections she could call and check. But she laughed in that way that peels paint and said all properties here are subject to summit standards, signed or not. And I'd find non-compliance expensive. After that, people who used to wave suddenly cared a lot about their mailboxes when I drove by, and a certified letter arrived with my coffee like an unwanted side of toast. The 500 fee, the 50 a day photos attached like evidence in a case. I didn't know I was on trial for copies to the county and the sheriff to make it look official. So I didn't yell, I made another pot. Opened a fresh binder and started what I always start when life goes sideways: documentation. The noise complaint rolled in a week later. Deputy Alvarez pulling up by my woodpile, looking like a man who wanted a different assignment, telling me someone said my generator was keeping folks up, while we both stood there listening to the kind of quiet you can only hear at 500 feet. And I pointed through the trees toward my nearest neighbor's place, a football field and a half away, and said we could take a walk and ask him if he'd like to file a report. He sighed and admitted this was sounding civil, and I said if he checked the state registry, he'd see our HOA was marked inactive, which is a funny status for an organization trying to fine people. He lifted an eyebrow and said he'd take a look, and that night I rolled out the old family deed under a brass lamp from Claire's desk, the paper smelling like years, and I put it beside the HOA's boundary map and saw something that made my neck prickle. My grandfather's iron pins on the ridge aren't where their map says they should be. 40 or 50 feet of disagreement. Not the kind of distance you shrug off. You'd think we'd have a quiet, neighborly talk. But Trish rented the community center and called it a safety meeting about my non-compliant structure, brought a projector and a PowerPoint with a title like Mountain Standards for a Safer Community, filled the room with folding chairs and the smell of wet wool as people shook snow off their boots. even coaxed County Inspector Diane Whitaker with hints of urgent hazards, then stood at a podium and clicked through blown-up photos of my cabin like she was arguing a Supreme Court case. And when she finished, I stood. Didn't raise my voice, just handed Diane the permit chain. The inspection reports with her signature, the letter from the county spelling out that HOA architectural sign-off wasn't required for my project because of the timing and jurisdiction line. And Diane read like a person who takes pride in her name, nodded and said, "My documentation was in order." While she talked, I noticed something on the HOA letterhead. Trish kept waving. The association's official address was the same as Kincaid Realty. Her office. And once you've smelled conflict of interest, you do not forget it. People started whispering. Ms. Rowe, a widow from the lower loop, said she'd been fined for bird feeders because they attracted undesirable wildlife. A young couple mentioned phantom fence violations with measurements that changed depending on who showed up. Walt Jensen, a Vietnam vet in a fifth wheel half the year, said someone kept photographing his trailer and leaving warnings like they were biohazard notices. And Trish's smile turned into a plank as she said, "We would not turn this into a grievance session." Back at the cabin, I called Earl Bennett at the recorder's office, a man who's read enough deeds to hear trouble before it hits the counter, and he told me to bring my binder. He'd make copies I could frame. And the next copy I got from Trish wasn't a letter at all. It was a lien filed like her inactive association could cloud my title. And that's a special moment for a bully, because it leaves a footprint you can measure. Then came the morning on my porch, dark, cold sun still behind the ridge. Trish immaculate. Alvarez and a second deputy named Sloan, a process server, holding a manila envelope. Like a relic emergency demolition notice for health and safety removal today. Deputies standing by until compliance, and I hit record on my phone and set it on the rail and said, "Deputies can enforce court orders, not private demands." This wasn't signed by a judge. It was something Trish typed after a glass of red. And a bad idea. Alvarez shifted his weight and looked at the letter, and at me. And at her. And the set of his jaw changed. And then she stepped closer, perfume sharp in the cold, and said low, "That people like me don't belong up here. I'm unpredictable. I live alone. It isn't civilized. Maybe if my wife were still around, I'd know how to act." And the temperature fell 10 degrees, and Sloan took a half step back, and my dog Ranger stood between us, with a sound I'd never heard him make. And I kept my voice steady and told Trish. Before she embarrassed herself worse, she might take a walk up the ridge and look for heavy iron posts stamped with 3 letters, U.S., and learn something about who has jurisdiction on this hill. They left without touching a shingle, the process server remembering somewhere else he had to be, and I poured coffee, strapped on snowshoes, clipped a GPS to my vest, and followed the old logging trace through timber that crackled in the cold until I found the first post. Iron-weathered stamped Lone Elk National Forest with a year that puts mules and chains in your head. Then a second, then a third, in a line that matched the calls on our dusty plat. I punched coordinates overlaid the public layers and watched a boundary line wrap my parcel like a blanket. Somewhere between the subdivision paperwork and the county's maps, a transfer that was supposed to happen. Never did the ridge stayed federal, every square foot of my cabin sitting on land managed by the United States. And there's a line you remember from civics, even if you never went to law school, supremacy clause, which means when federal and local rules collide, the federal side wins. And an HOA that loves to measure grass has exactly 0 to say about a cabin the government forgot to let go of. I called the Forest Service and got a specialist named Nina Hart, voice like spring runoff. And she said if the markers and layers matched, they'd expedite verification, and that I shouldn't let anybody touch the structure without a federal order. Then I called a friend who knows somebody at the FBI's white-collar unit, because if you file liens on property you don't control, and send threats using the wires, certain words start to fit, and meanwhile, Trish hired 2 guys with tactical beards to sit at the bottom of my drive and photograph hikers, plastered anonymous flyers at the cafe about my unstable behavior, called a veteran group to say I was a bad representative, spray-painted an orange X over 2 of my solar panels at 2 a.m. Like vandalism was a code section, and I took pictures of footprints and measured tread width and bagged paint chips and added it all to the binder. The worst play was her trying to hand Inspector Whitaker a consulting fee to discover violations that didn't exist. Diane called her boss, and the DA then called me and said I could quote her, and right after that, Trish sent an ultimatum by certified mail. Demolish within 72 hours or face maximum penalties, coordinated with state and federal authorities. Copied the sheriff of the county and a reporter named Evan Carter, whose camera moves faster than rumors, and that letter turned out to be the drum roll. Forest Service had finished their verification. Markers map survey, all in agreement lone elk boundaries wrapping my parcel since 9. And Nina said she'd sit front row when I made it public. Earl at the recorder's office compiled every filing the dormant HOA had touched and labeled the stack. Problems with a sticky that read, "Not how any of this works." Walt gathered statements from 6 families with their own Kincaid stories, and Evan went through realty transfers and found a pattern that made my coffee taste like gasoline, households under pressure selling quick, and a certain agent cashing checks. Trish must have felt the clock because she scheduled an emergency community hearing for Tuesday night and turned the center into the saddest courtroom theater you ever saw. Podium rented lights, printed name tags. People lined up in the cold breath like steam. And she opened with the voice of a prosecutor, and the smile of a closer said one resident was refusing basic standards that protect property values and safety. Said violations had been documented. Said escalation would happen if required. And she clicked through slides of my roof until I felt like a before photo in a home makeover show. That's when I stood with one manila folder and said, "Before we talk about federal authority again, maybe we let federal authority speak for itself." And she smirked and asked if I had something relevant. And I said I have the United States government. And I held up a packet stamped by the Forest Service, the kind of stamp that takes the oxygen out of a room. And I read the line that mattered. My parcel sits entirely within the boundaries of Lone Elk National Forest. It has since 19, which means the association never had jurisdiction to approve, deny fine lien, or threaten anything on that ridge. And the projector fan became the loudest sound in Colorado. You could hear snow slide off the roof outside, and Trish went blotchy pale, like a printer running out of ink. Said our covenants clearly state, and I told her, covenants don't apply to federal land. The supremacy clause isn't decorative, and filing liens and sending threats about property you don't control is a specific sort of fraud that people with badges care about. 2 people stepped forward like they'd been waiting on their cue. Special Agent Cole Ramirez with the FBI and investigator Nina Hart in a green field jacket. And Ramirez asked Ms. Kincaid to put her hands where he could see them. She said she was protecting property values. He said she had no authority over federal land and mentioned wire fraud and attempted extortion and false claims against government property. And then the cuffs clicked once a sound. I'll never forget, not because it was loud, but because it was final. That's where my story ends, not with a toast or a bonfire or a victory lap. Just a room that finally understood the difference between loud rules and real law. A projector washing out a last slide of my roof, and a neighborhood that went quiet in a better way than it had in months. Now it's your turn. Was this justice or overkill? HOAs protect communities, or just paper property values while people pay the price? Where should authority stop and common sense begin? Drop your honest take in the comments and tell me if you've lived a version of this. What worked, what didn't, who stood up and who didn't. Hit like if you want more. True life stories told straight. Subscribe if you believe bullies fold when receipts show up, and share this with that one neighbor who thinks a clipboard is a crown. Yeah, that happened.